The fight for Manila, capital city of the Philippines, was one of the great street-fighting battles of the Second World War, rivaling Stalingrad and Berlin in its ferocity and destruction. Manila, once described as the Pearl of the Orient, a city famed for 300 years of Western architectural heritage centered around the mini-Vatican City at its heart, known as the Intramuros, was utterly destroyed. The American drive to liberate Manila and the fierce Japanese resistance also resulted in a human tragedy of appalling scale and brutality. As they began to lose the battle, the city's Imperial Japanese Navy defenders took out their frustrations on the local civilian population in an orgy of rape and murder rivaling that committed on the hapless population of the Chinese capital city of Nanking in 1937. Japanese sailors ran amok, deliberately torturing and murdering as many innocents as they could lay their hands on. It was truly Manila's Götterdämmerung, the Japanese Navy's darkest hour in the dying months of the war in the Pacific. The Japanese Navy's greatest war crime was set in motion by the landing of Lieutenant General Walter Kruger's U.S. Sixth Army at Lingayen Gulf on the 9th of January 1945.
Sixth Army forces en route with the 7th Fleet to northern Luzon. Objective, to take the American flag back to Manila. U.S. guns battle Jap planes and 2 Jap destroyers, attempting to break into our convoy of more than 800 vessels. The camera, 6 miles from the action, records direct hits on the enemy vessels. Enemy air attacks off Lingayen Gulf. Lost to the enemy, 79 planes. A 3-day naval bombardment of the entire Lingayen Gulf area. On S-Day, 9th January, a 2-hour bombardment is concentrated on Lingayen Gulf's southern coast. Our landing forces moved toward shore almost unmolested, spearheading the greatest amphibious operation of the Pacific War. About 900 amphibious tanks, tractors, and ducks, and 2,500 LCVPs and similar craft were lowered into the Gulf. Pre-invasion minesweeping had revealed few underwater obstacles. Up to 100,000 men, under the command of Lieutenant General Walter Kruger, made landings at 4 points along a wide stretch of beach.
General Douglas MacArthur had promised that the Americans would return following his defeat in 1942, and return they did with unprecedented numbers and firepower. Kruger began immediately to drive south. On the 31st of January, Lieutenant General Robert Eichelberger's 8th Army landed unopposed at Nasugbu in southern Luzon and began moving steadily towards Manila. Major General Joseph Swing's 11th Airborne Division was the strongest element in Eichelberger's command. In a daring parachute drop, Colonel Orrin Hard Rock Haugen and the 11th Airborne's 511th Regimental Combat Team spearheaded the northern advance. The Japanese had done little to prevent American forces from advancing rapidly towards the capital, and the converging American columns, which set out on the 4th of February 1945, found intact bridges and shallow rivers to cross. But the Japanese were prepared to make the Americans fight for every inch of Manila, if necessary street by street and house by house. In overall command in the Philippines was General Tomoyuki Yamashita, the Tiger of Malaya, the famed general who with inferior numbers of troops had captured the Malayan Peninsula and Singapore from the British in February 1942. The Japanese 14th Area Army was subdivided into several groups, with the army troops garrisoning Manila consisting of Shimbu Group under the command of Lieutenant General Shizuo Yokoyama. Also stationed inside Manila was a large Japanese naval force covering the port and naval facilities across the city, known as the 31st Naval Special Base Force, under the command of Rear Admiral Sanji Iwabuchi. The problem for the future of Manila was inter-service rivalry and insularity between the Imperial Army and Navy. Although General Yamashita was in overall control of the Philippines, the naval forces operating within 14th Area Army had a separate command structure, Iwabuchi reporting to his own service chief, Vice Admiral Denshichi Okuchi, the commander of the Southwestern Area Fleet in the Philippines. Okuchi, in turn, reported directly to the combined fleet in Japan and not to General Yamashita. Yamashita realized that committing his forces to urban fighting against the Americans with their superior air power, artillery, and armor was foolish, and it would remove his ability to maneuver and strike at his opponent. There was also the problem of feeding upwards of 1 million citizens who were still inside the city when the Americans arrived, impossible for the poorly organized Japanese logistics train to cope with. Therefore, Yamashita ordered General Yokoyama to pull his troops out of the city into the mountains of northern Luzon, where a protracted defensive battle could be waged. Yokoyama had theoretical command over the Japanese naval troops in the city under Admiral Iwabuchi, and he ordered that the admiral withdraw his forces as well. When Vice Admiral Okuchi, Iwabuchi's superior, heard about Yamashita's withdrawal order, he in turn ordered Iwabuchi to defend to the last man the naval facilities and Nichols Field airfield in Manila. Okuchi informed Iwabuchi that the 31st Special Naval Base Force, along with ship's crews from Japanese vessels in the harbor and assorted naval support staff, would be formed into one new unit called the Manila Naval Defense Force, the MNDF. The MNDF was a motley collection of naval troops, ill-equipped or trained to take on the cream of the U.S. Army in Manila. Although the 31st Naval Special Base Force of infantry-trained soldiers formed its core, the remainder of the personnel had virtually no infantry training other than some drill and weapon handling. The withdrawal of General Yokoyama's Shimbu group of army troops saw the concomitant withdrawal of all armored support, most of the heavy weapons and artillery in the city, and professionally trained land warfare officers. This left the 17,000 men of the MNDF to scavenge what weapons they could, aside from the reasonably well-armed 31st Naval Special Base Force. American Springfield 1903 rifles, long in storage in Manila after the 1942 defeat, were issued to Japanese sailors, and heavier machine guns, hand grenades, anti-aircraft cannons, and field artillery were collected and distributed to the naval troops. Still, compared with the heavy equipment the Americans would shortly range against them, the Japanese sailors were only lightly armed. Their one great advantage was the fact the Americans would have to engage them in urban warfare, enabling the Japanese to create hundreds of static defenses, traps, and obstacles for the Americans to fight their way through. The second advantage the Japanese had was that they were prepared to sacrifice their lives in the battle for Manila, and 17,000 men who had nothing to lose was a formidable opponent indeed. On the 3rd of February 1945, elements of the U.S. 1st Cavalry Division under Major General Vern D. Mudge entered the northern suburbs of Manila, seizing a vital bridge across the Tuliahan River, the water feature separating American forces from the city proper. Japanese defenses had been laid out to cover both sections of the city. Army troops were involved in the defense, as General Yamashita had actually bowed to Admiral Okuchi's demand to defend the vital naval installations in the city, and placed under Admiral Iwabuchi's control a few thousand soldiers under the command of Colonel Katsuzo Noguchi. Called the Noguchi Detachment, they were ordered to dig in north of the Pasig. The defense of Manila was still, however, primarily a Japanese Navy affair. Iwabuchi deployed 4,500 of his men to support Colonel Noguchi north of the Pasig. A further 5,000, under Iwabuchi's direct command, would defend south of the Pasig, with 5,000 more in place to defend Fort McKinley and Nichols Field. A few thousand more naval troops were deployed on partially sunken ships in Manila Bay, or east of the city, towards the main army troops or Shimbu group in the mountains. With a bridge over the Tuliahan River in American hands, the first unit into Manila proper was a squadron of Brigadier General William Chase's 8th Cavalry Brigade, which drove into the massive campus of the University of Santo Tomas with immediate trouble. The university had been turned into a huge civilian internment camp during the Japanese occupation. The death rate among the prisoners had been slightly over 10%, with 466 deaths out of a total prison population of 4,255. Chase's men broke into the camp at 9 p.m. and fought the guards, while Sherman tanks crashed through the university walls. Placed under pressure, Lieutenant Colonel Toshio Hiyashi retreated with his 46 remaining men and a large contingent of internees to the education building. Demanding that he and his men be allowed safe passage to rejoin Japanese troops in the south of the city, Hiyashi threatened to slaughter his hostages unless the Americans agreed to his terms. On the 5th of February, the Americans reluctantly agreed, and the hostages were freed. After exchanging salutes, the Japanese were escorted to their own lines. As chance would have it, Hiyashi and his men went to the area around the Malacalang Palace, already occupied by American forces, and in the fighting that followed, Hiyashi and many of his men were killed. The rest ended up back in Santo Tomas as prisoners themselves. As General MacArthur announced the imminent recapture of Manila, his divisional commanders reported stiffening Japanese resistance to the north and the south of the city. Iwabuchi's men had heavily fortified their sectors of the city, including the ancient heart, the Intramuros, with barbed wire entanglements, minefields, trench systems, and roadblocks. It was to take the Americans a month of bloodshed to clear the city of its Japanese Navy and Army defenders. In the north, General Griswold pushed elements of his 14th Corps south from Santo Tomas University towards the Pasig River. The 2nd Squadron of the 5th Cavalry was ordered to seize the intact Quezon Bridge late on the 4th of February, but the attempt was defeated by strong Japanese resistance, and the Japanese blew the bridge. The next day, the 37th Infantry Division began its move into Manila, Griswold dividing the city into 2 sectors, giving the 37th the western half and the 1st Cavalry Division the eastern. By the 8th of February, units from the 37th Division had managed to clear up most of the Japanese from their assigned sector, but the methods they employed also killed thousands of innocent civilians. Because the Japanese were committed to a house-to-house resistance, when the Americans encountered dug-in defenders, they simply leveled the building with artillery fire and tank support. Street after street was destroyed in this way, creating massive civilian casualties and destroying the city's infrastructure and architecture. The Japanese also contributed to the destruction, and as units withdrew, they blew up buildings as they went. The Japanese naval troops dug in on Provisor Island, an industrial center on the Pasig River, put up a furious resistance that lasted until the 11th of February. Atrocities against the civilian population were also being committed by the Japanese, even as their lines were being threatened by strong American attacks. Time was running out for the brutal Japanese occupation of Manila. In the east, General Mudge's 5th Cavalry was involved in some heavy fighting, and the 7th and 8th Cavalry fought bitter battles to wrest control of 2 water supply complexes from the Japanese in the north of the city. By the 10th of February, the Americans had crossed the Pasig and were consolidating their hold over most of the city. However, the Japanese still strongly defended the Intramuros, Nichols Field, and Fort McKinley. The 11th Airborne Division had been halted before the airfield since the 4th of February, where Japanese naval troops, strongly supported by their limited field artillery, had held the Americans in check. Nichols Field finally fell to the American paratroopers on the 11th of February, a significant victory that allowed General Swing to complete the encirclement of Manila by day's end on the 12th. Trapped like rats, the Japanese continued to resist fiercely, but they also now decided to initiate an orgy of rape and murder within the areas of the city still under their control, in what came to be called the Manila Massacre. Vice Admiral Okuchi, commander of the Southwest Area Fleet, now safely headquartered with General Yamashita at Baguio City, received a radio message from the surrounded Rear Admiral Iwabuchi on the 18th of February. Quote, "I am overwhelmed with shame for the many casualties among my subordinates and for being unable to discharge my duty because of my incompetence. Now, with what strength remains, we will daringly engage the enemy. Banzai to the Emperor." Unquote. There would be no Japanese surrender, as Iwabuchi radioed, "We are determined to fight to the last man." The Japanese defenders now had nothing to look to except their own deaths in battle, and for many this grim prospect seems to have contributed to a feeling that they could do what they liked to the hapless civilians awaiting liberation, and do so with remarkable degrees of bestiality and sadism. Inside the once beautiful Intramuros walled city, pounded into ruins by the Americans, the fighting went on until the 28th of February. The ancient and well-built buildings provided excellent cover for the defenders, necessitating yet more destruction by the Americans, who simply blew up everything in their path that exhibited any sign of resistance, killing thousands more civilians. As one historian has commented, quote, "American lives were understandably far more valuable than historic landmarks," unquote. The very last pocket of Japanese resistance was the ruins of the Finance Building, which the Americans pounded with heavy artillery until all were dead inside. It was the 3rd of March 1945, a month since American forces had first entered the northern suburbs. The death toll was fearful. Approximately 100,000 Filipino civilians were deliberately killed by Japanese forces, and many thousands more by American efforts to recapture the city. Nearly 16,000 Japanese died, most of them naval troops, accounting for virtually their entire garrison. The Americans lost 1,010 killed and 5,565 wounded during the month-long fight in the fiercest urban fighting of the Pacific War. Although criticized by post-war Filipino government and others for the destruction they wrought on the city, an American battle report suggested, quote, "The destruction stemmed from the American decision to save lives in a battle against Japanese troops who had decided to sacrifice their lives as dearly as possible," unquote. General MacArthur could proudly state at the Malacalang Palace after the battle, "Your capital city, cruelly punished though it be, has regained its rightful place, a citadel of democracy in the East," unquote. The man deemed responsible for all of this suffering was General Tomoyuki Yamashita, commander of the Japanese 14th Area Army. When the war ended in August 1945, Yamashita and 50,000 troops were still resisting the American advance from their positions in the mountains behind the town of Baguio. Originally, the Tiger of Malaya had had an army of 300,000. Yamashita was placed on trial, even though he had withdrawn his army from Manila before the Americans had arrived, and had given orders that the city was not to be defended. With the death of Admiral Iwabuchi in the fighting in the city, Yamashita, as his nominal superior, would carry the can for the Imperial Navy's butchery of civilians. Quote, "The trial certainly brought out all the horrors of the closing days of Japanese authority in Manila," recalled journalist Dennis Warner, who attended the 1945 trial. But because the case was so hastily prepared, said Warner, much of the evidence related to what had happened in the city during February 1945. It seemed to some of us reporting on that trial that General Yamashita could scarcely be held accountable, even for command responsibility in that terrible period, unquote. After a trial lasting 42 days, Yamashita was found guilty of war crimes committed by the admirals not under his direct control, and he was executed by hanging on the 23rd of February 1946, close to the ruins of Manila. Yamashita certainly bore responsibility for war crimes committed by army troops in the surrounding countryside against so-called guerrillas during the closing stages of the war, and the British were keen to prosecute him for the murders of Chinese civilians and Allied prisoners of war, following the fall of Singapore in 1942. Yamashita, in his defense, argued that he bore no responsibility for the behavior of the Imperial Navy in Manila after he had withdrawn his forces. The tribunal, however, found him guilty because the Manila Naval Defense Force was part of Yamashita's 14th Army. As Warner commented, quote, "Justice on this occasion was perhaps not very kind," unquote. The scale of Japanese atrocities in the Philippines came close to their activities in occupied China, with the numbers of people butchered and the material damage they inflicted on the nation. The Tokyo trial listed 72 large-scale massacres and 131,029 murders as a bare minimum figure for Japanese war crimes victims in the Philippines. An incredible 14,618 pages of sworn affidavits concerning the Philippines were taken by American investigators, and each detailed a separate atrocity. Sorting out who was guilty and who bore responsibility over the guilty was difficult, given the short period of time allotted for war crimes trials after the war ended. Remarkably few Japanese responsible for the actual murders were ever tried, with most of the convictions and/or imprisonments or executions of those Japanese officers guilty of breaches of command responsibility, being that they had failed to control their men. Many thanks for watching. Please subscribe and share. You can also visit my new audiobook channel, War Stories with Mark Felton, details below. You can also help to support both of my channels at PayPal and Patreon, details in the description box below.